everyone, it's New Oren. I'm the Viking Union Gallery Director with AS Productions, and welcome back to another episode of PSA with ASP, the art section. Today I'm meeting with the lovely Jessyca Murphy, who's the director at Make.Shift, the Make.Shift project, which hosts music and art and other creative community-based events here in downtown Bellingham. So we're really happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I just do a little introduction too.
That's great.
Hi, I'm Jessyca Murphy. I'm the executive director at Make.Shift Art Space. Like Newt said, there's music, visual art. We have artist studios and practice spaces for musicians, and we also host a local community radio station, 94.9 KZIX.
Awesome. Cool. So let's start by talking about your background in the arts in general. So give me like a quick like history of your
Yeah.
experience in the arts and how you got started.
Yeah, I actually, like, when I was much younger, was more a literature nerd. I studied creative writing and was really into poetry and like poetry scene and stuff. Bellingham used to have a really active poetry scene for a long time, which has unfortunately kind of died out in more recent years. And I have a secret plan with one of our board members to revitalize that. But that's kind of like where I feel like my roots of creativity are actually more in writing. But interestingly, as I had more employment, where like my job was actually writing and editing, I feel like I kind of shifted more towards visual arts. I don't know if it's just when you're doing something for money, you start to like not have the same like pleasure that you get out of doing something just because you want to do it. And so I started working more as like an illustrator and doing some projects that were more like pen and ink drawing based. But I always really struggled with painting. Like I'm really terrible at painting and I would try and it would be awful. But I would always sew as like a way of doing craft projects and stuff like that. And then eventually I sort of like blended my art practices to work mostly in textiles. So like that's kind of my art journey. The like school side of stuff, I went to Western for creative writing, but then took a little break in between and went to the New School in New York for my graduate degree. I studied media studies. The degree itself was kind of like more of a praxis degree, so it was like you both were creating art and then also creating writing around the theoretical side of the things you were studying. And I also taught as a part of that. Thought I would go into academia, ended up in social work kind of fields for a little bit. And about a year ago was working at an organization where I kind of got to blend those two things, where we were bringing art classes to folks that had experienced trauma. So that was amazing to be able to like have both those skills in one place. And then this opportunity opened up and at Make.Shift. And I have a long history of being a volunteer and supporter of Make.Shift, and it really kind of made sense in a lot of ways for me to go out for this position, and came back to Bellingham, and it's been really great. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there that would be fun to touch on. Like,
Yeah.
What was your experience like at the New School? I've heard a lot
I
about
really
it.
loved it. Well, oh, sorry, what was that? I talked over you.
Oh, you're good. You loved it?
Yeah. I mean, I know that there's like any school, there's a lot, if you're like paying attention to like art school politics, there's things that are happening at the New School that maybe don't like always line up with their ethics, you know, like, but I think maybe every institution has those things that you could be critical of. But I really, really appreciated they have like a very both kind of radical, but also pragmatic approach to education. So they're very like, I don't know how much you know like the roots of how they started. Like basically they began as like a refuge for people that were for academics who were exiled from Europe during like Nazi regimes. And so that's how they became, was these people were moving to New York, these intellectuals that had been, anti-fascist and had moved to New York, and mostly because they'd been forced out of their home countries. And so it started with this very I guess communist kind of wanting to be anti-fascist, to be thinking about the working class as a priority, and having that lens of class analysis throughout all of the programs. And then it really just grew into a much larger institution and houses Parsons, which is a pretty big design school. And I also felt they had that critical analysis, that was so central to always taking that socio-political perspective. But at the same time, they really offered useful tools that to further your career, and was very focused on every single class that I took was you were required to submit a project to a festival or to a conference, and that was part of your grade. And I feel that setup was really successful for me in my own career, to have it be set up that way, where it wasn't just you were doing a completely theoretical practice. You also had to apply what you were doing in the real world and go for it, which I feel in my undergrad experience, that wasn't pressed as much of you actually have to submit whatever you're doing as a part of this class. And even if you don't get into what you're submitting, that's still a learning experience.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that sounds really awesome. Especially the critical thinking being a necessary component of the learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds really great. That's cool. Yeah, I've heard a bit about the new school. I'm sure that I've probably had some classes where we discussed the new school, but they were so long ago now that I don't remember.
Yeah.
But that's awesome.
Yeah.
And so
there's a lot of really prominent artists that came out of the new school. John Cage is probably one of the most famous alumni, besides Tim Gunn.
oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got a really cool legacy of really awesome experimental artists that have come out of there.
Cool. So, and you were there for how long?
So I did my master's degree part-time. So it took me about 3 years because I was working at the same time. And I only ended up living in New York for a year. I did most of my degree remotely. So it was really nice that they were super flexible. And I got to because of the whole thing where you had to apply for stuff, I got to travel all over the world and present at conferences and stuff. So it was a really cool opportunity because that was so much what they were focusing on, is getting their students out there and really doing things that furthered their careers and also helped them think critically about the work that they were doing.
Cool. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that literature was sort of your first love. So
Mm-hmm.
the writing that you did for your master's, was that more research projects?
Yeah, I did a lot more I guess social critical analysis. So a lot of what I was focusing on, even though my degree was in media studies, that I had a lot of overlap into fashion studies. So I actually taught in the fashion studies department at Parsons while I was doing my degree in media studies. And those things kind of are, Venn diagram with a big middle. So a lot of what I was looking at the time was some stuff around cultural appropriation in fashion. And I feel sometimes the limitations of writing things that are very topical at the time later on are not as topical. But I was looking at a lot of sort of cultural trends at that time. It was about 2010s, and looking at the sort of implications at that time. It was, I feel not to say cultural appropriation doesn't still exist, because it does, but I feel that was very much a trend at the time in the 2010s, and a lot of people were talking about it. And that was like so much what fashion was like based around at that time, was like, you know, tribal prints and all of these things. And that was a really big concentration of what I was looking at, was like that cultural analysis of what people were writing about, sort of those bigger sociopolitical implications of things that we usually think of as trivial, but how
Mhm.
they're really rooted in, you know, systems of oppression and a history of colonization.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
I don't know
know,
if I explained that well, but
no, that's great. I feel like a lot of the research papers that I've done that I've really enjoyed have been um, almost extrapolating some niche research interest to
Mhm.
the broader context of like 21st century American like social life or something like that.
Yeah,
And I think that the sociopolitical ties that you can create, that you can draw lines from your project to, I think are very interesting. So that's cool.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and especially the research that you were just talking about, I feel like that's something that even, I mean, I wouldn't know for sure, but my guess is that there probably wasn't a lot of scholarship
Mhm.
established at the time during the 2010s about the 2010s because it was happening. So I'm
Yeah,
sure that research is still ongoing. I think that yeah, I can see how that's you know, you've etched a place in this broader um, section of scholarship. So that's cool.
yeah.
Um, so what sparked your desire to work at a place like Make.Shift when you did return to Bellingham?
Yeah, well, I guess I should have mentioned in my like career description that for several years I was working as a gallery director at Make.Shift, and that was I was kind of had my feet into worlds of where I was doing advocacy for people who experience sexual and domestic violence, and that was kind of like my day job. And then on weekends and evenings, I was working as a gallery director. I had been involved with Make.Shift pretty much since it started, since it was like an idea in my friend's garage. And so it had always been something that was like, you know, when your friends start a project and you're always sort of like tangentially involved in some sort of way and supporting it. And so Make.Shift, it has always been that thing where it's always been a part of like, I feel like most of my adult life. And has really been, I don't know, like such a, like, I guess I'm kind of sentimental about it. Like it's this, you know, like place that, you know, it's a DIY venue that always encourages like people to experiment and make mistakes and like have new young artists like doing uh, things at a level that is kind of like lower stakes. Like I feel like we fit this really nice in between level of like we can have more emerging artists come in and do something that they might, it might be kind of like a test run for like trying to get at another level. And like what we really want to do is serve that uh like be that opportunity for people to be able to do something that they might be afraid to do elsewhere. And so I feel like there's that side of it where I'm just like, I love that there are spaces like that that aren't like, we have certain, I guess, like standards and expectations, but like we're not at a point where we're like super corporate or like expecting things to be incredibly polished. And I think that opportunity for experimentation is absolutely necessary for anybody who's a creative. So like there's that ethos part of it. And then in terms of my career, things kind of lined up in all of my life that it worked and made sense that I was able to kind of like take a risk of, you know, be like, okay, I'm putting kind of all my eggs in this basket of like stepping into this leadership role. And Make.Shift's a very small nonprofit and has a lot of room to grow in terms of being like a sustainable organization that can pay everyone a living wage and like um, I really just wanted to always see it become that and like be that space that people could, make a career and not have to leave Bellingham to be a creative. Like it's such a narrative of like people love this city, but they can't get a job in the area that they are passionate about. And I really was feeling like I wanted to move back to Bellingham. And I was living in Seattle for a little bit and have lived in other bigger cities, but um, I wanted to be a part of the people that were trying to make this a sustainable place to live, that you could actually um, like, I don't know, that we could keep some of that creative energy that comes out of Western, that comes out of like, just any kid growing up in a small town, and uh, not make people feel like they have to leave just to be able to express themselves.
Totally. Yeah, I'm definitely experiencing that now. I'm not originally from the area, but the longer I've lived here, the more I've come to really love it. And as I'm about to graduate, I'm like,
Mhm.
what am I gonna do? Like, I can't imagine living anywhere else now that I've been
Yeah.
here. Um, and I especially can't imagine not living near the water. That's just such a luxury that we have.
Yeah.
Um, but I really admire that Make.Shift is a space that's sort of dedicated to trying something out. I think that that's really cool. It's been really fun for me as someone who's frequented Make.Shift in the before times.
Yeah.
That what I saw at Make.Shift were things that I don't think I would have seen otherwise. And that's also like um, being exposed to the studio art students at Western has been amazing because that's not a path that I personally chose. But for those who did choose that, the resources and the mentorship that I've seen students create or use to create new work through Western has been breathtaking. Like I've seen so much amazing work come out of students from Western.
Yeah.
And I think that that same level of like energy and dedication and creativity is present in a lot of the projects that are housed at Make.Shift, which is really cool. I definitely think that Bellingham is a thriving creative community in every like field, in every art field. So
Yeah.
it's awesome that Make.Shift is like a hub for all of that.
Yeah. And I would say too, like Bellingham has such an amazing like creative community, and I always think it's kind of just a bummer that it cycles through so much when, because people feel like they can't stay here. And I feel like the community could do even more to like support something that's already here, like rather than like, watch it kind of dissipate every 4 years, like, to be able to like foster it and keep it going, because it's something that draws a lot of people to the community.
Yeah. Um, so this is maybe backtracking a little. Um, what are some of the challenges that you've personally faced in trying to establish yourself in a career in the arts?
I mean, I think the age old thing is just being able to pay your bills and also do the things you love. I think for me personally, on my own personal art practice, I think a lot of artists are like this. Like I'm terrible at marketing myself. Like I just want to like, be like, oh, if you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. It's fine. But in order to like go for more of those opportunities, like you do have to have in your arsenal that like, several paragraphs about why what you make is important and like why it matters and why it's relevant. And like I will admit for myself, like that was a like psychological hurdle to like get over and be like, okay, I just have to talk about myself like I'm talking about my friend, like, and not make it not feel like you're like boasting or, being narcissistic, because it's just necessary if you're like, submitting to a show or if to be, in a gallery show or I had done a public art project a year ago, and there's a whole litany of things that you have to fill out that you have to talk about yourself. So I would say that had been a hurdle for me, and something that helped me get over that is the work of Beth Pickens. Have you ever read her work? She's amazing. She just came out with a new book, and I highly recommend it. But she wrote a book called Your Art Will Save Your Life in about, I think 2016. And I found that super inspirational because it was really, it's kind of like a self-help book, but it was sort of like reframing, like, oh no, you are an artist, you're a creative person. This is part of who you essentially are as a human being. And it's okay to like focus on that in terms of what you want to do with your life. And I think we live in a world that wants to trivialize creativity, and kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of judgment around if you decide that that's like really what you want to do with your life, and easy to get sucked into that judgment and put it on yourself. And so I think there's that side of it that's more like in my own head. And then I think there is the just like reality that it's easier if you have a cushion or a support network or people in your life that will like support you through taking risks. Like I think I've had parts of my life where it was hard to get out of the idea of having like a really standard 9-to-5 job where someone else is paying me. And I realized that like a lot of my own privileges have allowed me to be like, okay, this is fine. I can like be a little bit more flexible or have less of a safety net from having like that consistent day job. And I think when you do the like double grind, which I've done for years of like, I've throughout my life usually had 3 or 4 jobs at any given time. And it's like such a quick path, I think, to burnout if you're like, working your 9-to-5 or you're working your like retail job or your food service job. And then on top of that, whether you're an artist or musician, like playing shows every weekend and like basically then not sleeping when you have to go back to work early in the next day. And like making, like I used to go into my studio at 7 a.m., work for 2 hours every day and then go to my job. Like, and you can get really super burnt out on like that whole, I don't know, grind. Like, and so I just feel like there's so many people, especially from the work that I've done in working with folks that have experienced like really hard life circumstances and fostering creativity for like, and providing opportunities for people in that situation. It's clear to me how many people could offer such incredible things to the world, like, but just can't because of their economic situation. And they're never going to have the opportunity to foster, to like keep working on it, and to keep putting it out there, because they have to survive. And I don't know if I figured out the perfect formula, but I will say that that's always a factor, is like trying to just like deal with a world that undervalues artistic labor. And yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can empathize with the same struggles. I know that so I'm about to graduate from Western, and I still have my parents saying like, what do you do? What are you studying? I don't understand. Like they just don't. I think that they're coming from a place where, their whole lives they've done like hard labor, like physical labor, family business, that sort of thing. And no one ever went to college. So when I'm like, this is what I'm doing, this is what I spend all my time on, this is why I'm so tired all the time, or I'm so stressed out. And because it is surrounding art in general, they're like, that seems like a huge waste of time. And I'm like, I am trying to convince myself that it's not. I don't need that additional criticism, although know, like thanks, but I, I didn't ask for it. Um, yeah, I think a lot of people, regardless of like which, um, like what their concentration is, if they're a student, it's like I imagine that doing like art studio is probably one of the hardest passions to um, build like a sustainable career out of, because there are so many talented people who are all vying for the same opportunities in your area or in your region. And, you know, that's like I mentioned earlier, that's not the path that I went down, but
Yeah.
I can't imagine being like spit out at the end of 4 or 5 or however many years of schooling with this great body of work and then going, do I have the business or the marketing skills to then do something with this?
Yeah.
Um, because I don't feel like I have those skills either. And I wish I would have known that sooner to take like business classes, or I know that at Western there's a new minor, which is like the
Mhm.
entrepreneurial, it's like a entrepreneurial set of classes for
That's
creative
great.
students.
Yeah.
Um, and I have had friends who go into that minor, and I've had some other friends who've taken 1 or 2 classes like that, and I'm just like, wow, I wish someone would have told me that this existed, because
Yeah.
and that I would have felt better prepared. I think that that's one of the things that is maybe lacking for people, like you said. Everyone needs that like marketing skill
Mhm.
in their arsenal, and yeah, it's just one of those things that I wasn't told I needed. And I'm sure lots of other people can relate.
Yeah. And I think there's also like, I don't know, for your own sanity, like I think having that like emotional distance of like, I don't know, like you are kind of playing the game and
Yeah.
versus like getting like sucked into it. Cause I feel like I have a lot of friends on like different like places in the continuum of, an art career or music career. And sometimes people can buy way too much into the like marketing your brand and like getting your name out there, and they're like become the worst people to ever be friends with. And then like there's the folks that are just I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but like
You can
forget
say
it.
whatever.
uh I'm not going to do anything that contributes to capitalism. And like while I respect and get that point of view, you do then kind of have to be like, okay, well, I'm never going to be able to make this what I do every day, if I don't find that balance between like how much of the game am I playing, and then how much am I keeping my authentic self, you know, protected versus like becoming this like, I don't know, sort of soulless corporate machine, like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Mm. I think that's the fear that we all have. How do I
yeah.
prevent myself from becoming a soulless cog in the corporate machine? So you've been at Makeshift for a long time. How many years?
Well, I mean, I've supported it since it started in like 2009.
Mhm.
I was an employee of Make.Shift as a gallery director from 20 like 17 or 18 until 2020, when I moved away for a bit and lived in Seattle and did work there. And then I came back to this position as the executive director in just December of 2020. So
Mhm.
Katie Gray, the wonderful, beautiful Katie Gray, was the director before. And Emily Campbell has taken over the gallery. She's also awesome, and she's the current gallery director. And so, yeah, I've been a part of Make.Shift in some capacity like, since 2009 when it started.
Mhm.
So, um, on like in different ways as like volunteer or donor or however I could help.
Have you had a favorite role so far?
I think I'm still getting my footing as like the director of the whole space. So I mean, there's definitely benefits to like having my hands in like every single different program. I'm definitely learning a lot about radio since that was not like my expertise level. I had shows on radio before, but certainly wasn't I'd never managed a radio station before. Um, I mean, I will say my heart will always be in the gallery because that's like where I worked for years, and visual art is definitely like my passion. But I've also been in bands, played music, and so it's nice to have a place like Make.Shift where I can kind of like have my hands on all these different like mediums that I myself enjoy and have taken part of. So I don't know. I don't think I have like a favorite.
Yeah. Um, that's awesome that you are now in this position that's sort of overseeing everything, but you've also been able to experience individual elements of Make.Shift before.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah.
I would hope to one day have that sort of like intimate relationship with my place of work, whether it's like an organization or hopefully a nonprofit like Make.Shift. That would be great. So I don't want to ask too many questions regarding the pandemic because we've all lived it. We're tired of it. But I am curious about some of the challenges that you've experienced at Make.Shift and how Make.Shift has weathered the pandemic so far.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's an inevitable question for like right now, everybody wants to know, like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? And I mean, I will say as like a like preamble, I think I don't know, I feel like there's almost been like too much emphasis in the world on like successful pivoting during the pandemic and stuff. And um, while that can be admirable, I also think like what's unique about Make.Shift is we've tried to always like be a place that's more community centered and like more centered on humans rather than, you know, whether or not we're making enough profit. And sometimes that ends up being, you know, like you get into a spot where you're like, oh crap, I need to remember that I need to keep the lights on if you're focusing way too much on how everyone's feeling. But I think during the pandemic, it was just like really important to us to not put too much pressure on staff and volunteers, like given how much especially creatives were impacted by the pandemic and not being able to perform, not being able to, you know, show your workplaces. And so we were like, I know that Katie before me, since I came in just at the end of 2020, like had to weather a lot of this more so than I did. But just trying to be that place of like support through a really hard time. And like one of the things that we did was start a like fundraiser for COVID relief. And so we've done what we could for artists that were struggling, giving them some stipends based on how many donations we received. And we had an awesome partnership with the local restaurant where we were able to raise they were able to raise $4,000 for the fund, which was really great. And I think that was a big part of our focus. The radio station became more of a focus because it was one of the only things we could still do. And so it really brought some more central focus to KZAX because obviously we can't have other types of music performances. And mostly, I think like with a lot of places, we were able to see some of those like silver linings of like we had to put our gallery online and we had been meaning to have more of a digital archive of artwork. So it was like, oh great, in a way this is just forced us to do a thing that we wanted to do anyway. And I mean, in terms of how we've weathered it, I feel like that's, I'll know the answer when it's like all over. You know, we're lucky in that we have our studio program, which allows, pretty much always allows us to be like at least financially okay. And for the most part, while there was maybe a little bit more turnover than normal. Like our studio program still stayed pretty consistent and we still had regular tenants. So unlike some other organizations that were like purely getting all their income from performances, like we were at least able to like financially weather the pandemic okay, and like have qualified for some, you know, support through different grants and stuff like that that were pandemic relief. So um, I would say it hasn't hit us as hard as it could have. But I think I'm interested to see how things are when we go back and how that impacts how people feel about live events and like
Mhm.
what the vibe is of like,
Yeah.
you know, entertainment and like and public gatherings. Like I think things are gonna feel really different. And so it's hard to know what all the impacts are until um we're actually back in the swing of things. And we probably aren't going to even open up in limited capacity until the fall, just because we have our tenants. So um, we've we aren't going to like expose our. We're going to like prioritize our tenants. So like we're sort of not going to open until we're in like the next phase, so that like our tenants don't have to feel at risk being like exposed to the public. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So what phases, or I guess what's going on at Makeshift right now? Is there still a large focus on radio?
I would say radio is one of the biggest focuses right now, but also our gallery being online. And so that I think those are our two biggest things right now. We've had a few like live streams and stuff that we've been able to do when they kind of like work out. We haven't really had like a regular show schedule for our live streams in the same way we might have when we were open. It's more so like, you know, if somebody wants to do it, then we're like, yeah, sure. And I mean, there's other things like coming down the pipeline that I'm like, we'll probably be able to announce if people are paying attention like in the future to like our socials and stuff. But there's some like projects that we're working on, some partnerships that we're working on for like the future, and that I'm very excited about. We're kind of trying to build out our, especially with our art gallery, like being able to partner with other organizations or businesses to be able to like offer curatorial services for different like projects that they're trying to bring to their business or organization. And so that's a program that we're working to build out, so that we can be that conduit between like a place that wants to show art or bring art into their building, but doesn't know how, doesn't have anyone on staff that's connected to the arts community, and kind of have us be that go between, that middle person, like to be able to connect people to artists, since we have such a large network and staff who can, staff and volunteers and interns who can use those like undervalued soft skills of like, okay, well, you're going to want this type of artist in your space because the aesthetics will blend with what your goal is for how you want your clients to feel or how you want your customers to feel. And that's something that like we're, speaking of that marketing thing, like trying to market that to like, we actually have a useful skill. This isn't just like a thing that, you
Yeah.
know, is a fun thing that people do. It's like we actually have like pretty concrete skills as creatives to like be able to create an aesthetic that fits an intended impact, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed just in my time working with AS at Western that there's almost every department at Western has this really strong desire to incorporate artwork or like rotating like gallery walls into their building or their department.
Yeah.
And the main like contact for art at Western is the Western Gallery, but it's what, like two or three like full-time
Mm-hmm.
people dedicated to that space, and they're also taking care of the collection. So there's a real, I think, maybe an overlooked need for um, like a go-to established person to take care of that sort of thing for
Yeah.
any organization. I know a friend of mine does stuff in like healthcare, and like put some
Mhm.
art up in like healthcare spaces. And that's something I never would have thought of as like a need.
Yeah.
But it's there. And it's cool to realize that I can do a lot more with my art degree than
Yeah.
I thought I could. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other things that you're looking forward to in not only a Make.Shift, but in the overall Bellingham art scene?
I am excited for like, I know there have, even despite the pandemic, been like new spaces opening up and new galleries and stuff. And I mean, I know that like I've heard so much criticism on the idea of like getting back to normal. So like I feel like I know it'll be different, but I am, I don't know, so excited to be in spaces with other creative people again, and just like having um those events and those openings where you just get to talk about things that everybody's passionate about. And I will admit I miss that a lot. And I'm interested to see how, like, I don't know, like there's a lot of stuff that over the pandemic, I mean, I'm sure you're aware that, you know, there's a lot of social issues that I feel like because people are kind of like under pressure of being in this lockdown that have, you know, been pushed to the fore. And I'm interested to see how like the creative community tries to address those things, you know, either in the work that's being produced or in collaborations that are happening. And like I'm most passionate about projects and things that try to not just be art, but like be a way that makes the world better and makes your community better, and is like, you know, like hyper local with like a global outcome sort of thing, you know, like trying to think bigger than just like an individual art project. And knowing that there's so many, especially with like the issues around housing, that have been, at least in my networks, like talked about so much more than I think they were before.
Mhm.
Like I really want to see more of the creative community like try to think of ways that we can lend our skills to like address some of these issues. Because I, in my mind, like a, a community or a, you know, city or whatever works best when like there is a place for like all those different skill sets like in solving really complex problems. And
Mhm.
um, I feel like it's a little abstract, but that's usually like where my brain goes.
No, that's great. I love what you just said, that there's that a community works best when there's space for everyone's skills to be
Hmm.
put towards a shared goal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that was definitely well said. I have the same interest that I think some of my, as a, I don't want to say consumer, but as like a consumer of arts in general, someone who's um, studying art and exhibitions and seeing what other people are doing around the world. I think some of the things that impact me the most, that I am really drawn to, are those projects that speak to something greater than the individual or the object that they're showing. Um, because I feel like there's, I mean, of course, there is a role for purely beautiful things to exist. I love that. Um, but in terms of like, I don't know, 21st century contemporary art, I think that there is definitely a need and a desire for um, representation in the arts of the issues that everyone is experiencing, the things that impact
Yeah.
everyone. And I think that art is one of those things that, you know, even if you're like a, if you have a passing interest in art, maybe you go occasionally with some friends or family to a museum, an exhibition or a talk or something might get you to think about this issue that you may not have thought about before, or you may not have seen through that perspective before. And I think that alone is really powerful. So um, yeah, I would love to see more of that in general as well. That
Yeah.
actually brings me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say one thing that like a concrete example of that popped into my head was that I went to this conference in Detroit several years ago, and they had this project that they featured, and the idea, I can't remember what city it was in, it might have been Philadelphia, but they had like I guess essentially like an artist in residence at a government building. And so the artist's role, it was like an ongoing like program that their arts commission had set up. And so whoever's the artist in residence at the I can't remember if it was like a courthouse or if it was just like where, you know, like the city hall. Um, like their role was sort of to create art, public art that would reflect on like the current issues that were going on in that community at the time. And it allowed like both the public and elected officials to be able to see things in a different light that they might not when they're just thinking about, you know, like bills and, you know, the constituent that calls you every day to complain about something on their lawn, like, you know, like it was like got them out of, you know, that's the everyday tedium that they're experiencing, and looked at an issue from a different lens. And it like got the community talking about, like, you know, in each case, like whatever issue the artist was focusing on. And I feel like those are things that I would love to see happen in Bellingham, given that I feel like Bellingham is a little bit more like involved in local politics than some other places are, like more so than some other places that I've either lived in or visited. And so I just think there's so much potential for like using creativity to shift people's lenses and start conversations. But I kind of interrupted you, so.
No, you're good. That was great. I love that you provided an example. Yeah, I had another question written down, which was, what is something that you see lacking in the arts world in general, or even here locally? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of hearkening to the arts world in general, going back to like kind of my previous answer of just like accessibility. I think that the small amount that I've been exposed to the more like real art world, um it is so insular and about who knows who, and you have to be in the right place and you have to get lucky a lot of the time. And I mean, most of the people who like, it's funny, I saw like I think it was like a TikTok or something that was talking about this, that was like, go ahead and Google every person who you see as like a hotshot artist right now, every up and coming artist, and you'll probably find that, you know, either their parents or their uncle is a movie star or a politician, or, you know, like, or somebody who's, you know, already well known. And there really isn't as much of a I don't know, like a obvious way to get into the arts, I guess. Like it's so obscure. And I think there's kind of two sides of like, more of the establishment needs to break down that opaqueness. But then also I think artists can think of different ways to consider something a legitimate art career. And I think sometimes we only have this one goal in mind of like, oh, I'm gonna be the next Jeff Koons, and that's my only destination, and I
mm,
can't, you know, do anything else. And I think that if like we can be kinder to ourselves of like, there are lots of ways to have a creative career, and there are lots of ways to, you know, make an impact, and it doesn't just have to be being the top art star, since that's so not attainable for most people. And I don't think that means that people have to like give up and go into a boring career that they don't like, just because that one rare thing isn't attainable. So yeah, I feel like I like I would like to see like just locally and larger, like more conversations about like, I don't know, what counts as like a legitimate artist, because I think that as creatives, we kind of dump on ourselves more than we need to. Like,
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, I don't know if that totally makes sense, but yeah, I feel like that real artist conversation always like bums me out, because there's a lot of ways to like consider yourself an artist.
Yeah. I mean, if the bar is at, you have to have like a solo at a large encyclopedic collecting museum,
Yeah.
then I think the bar is too high and definitely extremely exclusive, insular, like you said. Um, yeah, I still, if when use the phrase the art world, it feels like a joke to
Yeah.
say, because it's like, what is that? And are we
Yeah.
referring to this like upper echelon of people with connections and um, all of this experience that is not accessible to everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it is kind of a joke, but it also is like a very well-known phrase that I think can encapsulate all of these other niches within arts, like spaces such as Make.Shift. Like,
Yeah.
there's a place for that in the art world. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's kind of nuts.
Yeah. I mean, the art world is a real thing. That when I hear that phrase, I mean, I think of like what is the uh, that group of people that are, just because of how much money they have, they get to make decisions
Right.
and they get to decide like
Yeah.
who goes for more at auction, or who, counts as, being in this, particular collection that encapsulates a time period or a space. And I mean, those, in my career, I've had like the tiniest exposure to like some of that, and it is a real thing. There's a real group of people in every like major metropolitan city that are those tiny tastemaker decision makers.
Mhm.
And um, I will say, from some people that I've met, there is a desire to like break some of that down, but I think that that's, you know, embedded in the structure of our economy, and there
Yeah.
would have to be extremely large shifts in terms of how capitalism operates for that model to
Really.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, there's so much to be said here, but just looking at the history of like art museums and museums,
Yeah.
actually, not just art museums, but it's wealthy white men who pillaged things from other places and stole them and were like, I'm going to create a room for myself. I'm going to bring all my wealthy friends and all the ladies I want to get to know over here to
Yeah.
show them all my stuff that I know nothing about, that I stole from other people. It's
Yeah.
like, that's exactly what it is still. And
Yeah. They just let some white women in too.
yeah,
And they call
exactly.
that
They let a
progress.
select few of white women in as well. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much else we could talk about. Um, but let's see. I had two final questions for you. So we talked a lot about Make.Shift, and I think it would be great for you to touch on how those who are interested in getting involved with Make.Shift can do
Yeah.
that. How can they support y'all and get involved?
Definitely. I mean, in terms of getting involved, obviously right now it's a little bit more difficult. Usually, like in non-pandemic times, I would be like, show up, tell us what you're interested in, just walk in the door. Since we like, I feel like we're in a unique space where like usually in normal times we were able to like, have a conversation with somebody who was interested in getting involved and like hear that they had this cool idea, and a lot of times it was like, okay, let's do it, like. So I think there are some proper channels for some things, but for the most part, if you have a cool idea, we probably can make it happen. And if somebody reaches out, we'll just try to see what we can do to support that concept. um, but right now, I mean, we have, if you're like a visual artist, we usually have a few open calls like throughout the year that people can submit to, paying attention to either our Instagram or our website, or signing up for the newsletter, which people can do through the website, is usually the best way to like hear those announcements. And then it's usually in about August, late summer, early fall, when when the gallery opens up our annual call for artists. So like folks who are interested in being a part of group or solo shows for the coming year. So that's a time period for any practicing artists to like make sure you're checking in and see if, you know, if that's something you want to do. If you want to show art in our gallery, then apply for that. And with being on the radio, if you're a musician, sending your info to CUGS, like all the contact info is on our website at makeshiftproject.com. And we encourage especially local musicians to send us their any recorded music that they have, like whether that's a CD or something online. And if you're interested in volunteering, there's not as many opportunities right now. In the future, we'll amp back up our volunteer opportunities for like folks that are attendants in the gallery or working door at shows eventually when we're able to do that again. But right now, people can always send me an email and tell me what they're interested in getting involved with. We actually right now are looking for a videographer intern to amp up some of our online presence and do kind of things like this. And so our website right now is usually the best place to like find out if you want to do something. Click on that section, that program, but like tab and find the right person to talk to. In terms of supporting us, I should also say, there is a donate button. So always we can use support. Most of our, besides our studios, majority of our like profits that we're able to use to pay staff, to do projects, to pay artists, come from donations from the public. Like we're kind of, a lot of nonprofits don't really operate in the same way that we do. Like they usually depend on like major gifts, but we're kind of one of those rare places that actually has been able to work like the peer-to-peer sort of model with like, you know, like crowdsourcing, like just even like people, you know, regularly sending in $10 like makes a difference for us when it all accumulates over time. We recently started a Patreon as well that's mostly focused on KZACs, and so people can search us through there. And we actually have a fund drive coming up next week that I should probably plug, but I don't know if that'll be over by the time this airs. But
this is actually going to go up tomorrow.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, then tune in to KZACs starting on the 18th until the 25th. And we'll be doing our fund drive, and volunteers and staff will be on air from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. and playing cool local content.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, there's so many ways.
I know, it's like we do that. We're like the Renaissance organization, you know, we do like all of the things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we needed it. I think every city needs a space like Make.Shift.
Yeah.
Okay, and then my last question for you is, you know, this series is geared towards people like myself, like my peers who are emerging creatives. Either they're students or they're just trying to get into a new field. They want to pursue a dream of being a creative in a some creative field, whether it's film or music or art or the behind the scenes folks. What is something that you want those people to know?
I think maybe this is cheesy, but taking care of yourself, I think, is really important. Because like I was saying before, I think that like we undervalue the like amount that like the psychological element plays in our ability to like focus on our careers, especially as creatives. And there's a toxic narrative that, you know, being mentally ill is somehow better for you, like as a creative person. And in my experience, I have been much more productive and much more creative when I am taking my meds and going to therapy and all of that stuff. Like, I think that I would like to see that narrative die off, that we need to all be like, melodramatic, sad little artists.
Yeah.
So that would be my message to people is it's okay to take care of your mental health, and you don't have to be to be an artist, you don't have to be tortured.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I feel like that's not something that I don't know. I haven't heard that one yet. That's a great answer. Um, well, thank you so much, Jessyca, for joining me. I think we had a great discussion. And I'm so excited to see what's going on at Make.Shift in the future. And, one of these days, there'll be a show or something, maybe another art walk where people crowd the gallery. We'll see.
Crossing my fingers for September.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully everyone, I think today people who are 16 and older can get vaccinated. So that's a win. That's super exciting. Okay, cool. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.